Welcome to the game where we go play by play, breaking down the game of politics. Today, we're going to be digging into the headlines, into the news shaping the headlines. First, we're going to look at warships. They're getting closer to Venezuela. Why is Trump zeroing in on Caracas? Second, Washington takes a bold step. They take 10% ownership of Intel. We're going to be looking at the benefits, the pros and cons, what's right, what's wrong, and where could this lead down the line. And third, we're going to be looking at some of the roadblocks that Donald Trump is facing when it comes to the courts on the topics of immigration, on the topics of tariffs. And lastly, over the weekend, you might have seen on X, on Instagram, possibly on TikTok, did the president pass away over the weekend? Obviously not, but why did that pick up steam? And all of the headlines coming here. I got two great guests joining us this morning. Here in studio, we have Driena Sixto. She is the host of Claro y Directo, a Spanish language daily news. She is also a longtime leader within Turning Point USA and Turning Point Action. Here for the second time. Driena, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. And joining us also, Daniel D. Martino. He is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a PhD candidate of economics at Columbia University. He is the founder also of the Dissent Project, which, Daniel, welcome to the show. I know this is your first time. Great to have you on. Daniel, I want to start with you, and I want to look into the fact that President Trump, in his first term, historically was one of the presidents who did not take us into war, or where wars did not happen during his presidency. Obviously, the war on Ukraine, and then Hamas attacking Israel. Now Israel in Gaza happened during the Biden administration. But now Donald Trump has zeroed in on Venezuela. He's looking at Caracas. He's looking at Maduro. He's called out and even risen the amount that will be given, up to $50 million if Maduro is entregado to the American public, to the U.S. government. So why this shift in policy? Why does Venezuela matter to the Trump administration, in your opinion?
Well, I think we have to understand that what's happening with the Maduro regime is part of the fight of the administration against drug cartels, right? Just like they've been open to striking the Mexican drug cartels, they also declared Maduro regime to be a terrorist organization. Because they run a drug cartel called the Cartel of the Suns. So that is the kind of thing that they're looking at. They understand that 1/4 of the world's cocaine trafficking goes through Venezuela. That's why they just destroyed one boat carrying drugs yesterday, right from Venezuela, with the military presence in the Caribbean. So that's very good when it comes to reducing the revenue of the Maduro regime, which is how they stay in power with drug trafficking. And you also have to understand that, this is an illegitimate regime. This is not just a government we don't like Mexico, for example, right? We might not like Claudia Sheinbaum, but Claudia Sheinbaum was democratically elected. The Maduro regime was not. They've been in power for 26 years, my entire life. And they are working with China, they're working with Russia. They are not only putting drugs into the U.S., but they're sending criminals like the people from Nicaragua that have come to the U.S. They've killed dissidents of Venezuela abroad, like in Chile, and they've attempted to do that in Venezuela. They host Iranian drone factories, and they have the largest oil reserves in the world. And they're right in front of the United States in the Caribbean Sea. Actually, we share, the United States and Venezuela, maritime borders with Puerto Rico.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and you hit it at some of the beliefs that I think somewhat are beyond what the administration has said. Driena, to Daniel's point, the administration has said that drug trafficking is the main reason why they're there. And let's be honest, it does add up to a lot of the other rhetoric that we've heard from the administration. From the beginning, they declared several cartels, gangs from Latin America as terrorists, right? This is something that is new. No other president has actually declared these organizations. I mean, these are people that are actual organized criminals, very sophisticated. So this is not new. This is not the first time the president has sort of declared this war. However, I think there's a bigger story here, right? I mean, to Daniel's point, Venezuela is a key part, a key entry point for China, for Russia. Historically, the U.S. has had the Monroe Doctrine approach to Latin America. Do you think how much of this, that second part, is the Trump administration considering, and how far do you think they go?
So I think that there's definitely an element of showing strength, right? Peace through strength. Let's be honest, the United States has intervened in the politics of Latin America historically very often. The only thing is that they do it covertly, right? And we have been responsible for these regime changes. The difference, I believe, here is that a lot of Venezuelans here in the US, as of January 2025 this year, there is apparently 607,000 Venezuelans with TPS status here in the US. And there's even more here in the US that have legal residence. And then I believe there's about 25% of Venezuelan immigrants in the US that have voting capabilities.
Yeah.
Right. So the Venezuelan community in South Florida, we know, strongly supported
very
the
powerful.
president, yes, and his election. And so I think that we have the capabilities as a country to subvert different regimes and topple administrations of what we call third world countries. And we have the ability to do it quietly. But why would we want to do that when we can show that we are actually responsible for doing it, and then have the Venezuelan American community grateful to this administration for toppling what is an illegitimate regime, for toppling a dictatorship? We want to take credit for that. So I think that's one way of looking at things, that maybe we just want to show what the U.S. is doing for certain Americans here in the U.S. because it benefits us strategically, obviously, because yes, they have large oil reserves, because yes, they are a narco state. So yes, it benefits our security as a nation, but it also, on top of that, would benefit and would make happy a sect of the U.S. population of Venezuelan background that strongly has supported the president before. So we don't need to do things quietly. We want to be loud about it. The other thing that is absolutely true is that China has a hand in this, and China is an enemy of the United States. A report by the Washington Post came out just a few days ago detailing how it is an alarming fact that fentanyl seizures have greatly been reduced at the border. We are not having the same amounts that we were getting before.
Yeah.
And because they're being a lot more strategic in how they funnel it into the country and how they hide it. Now, I learned this just a few days ago as well, that a lot of the chemicals that fentanyl needs to be actually produced come from where? China. And so China is bringing in the chemical components of fentanyl, and then it is being put together in states, in narco-terrorist states like Venezuela, like Mexico. So it is true what the administration is saying as well, that this is an issue of national security because of drug trafficking. And it is also a hemispheric security issue where we can't have countries like China having too much support or too much power too close to home.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating conversation because some of your points here line up with Trump's brand, in the sense that Trump is not one to move quietly.
No.
He's not one to move under the radar. I think he's someone who has demonstrated that he's not afraid to show what he wants and to move with power. Like, don't call my bluff because I will move on it. Many folks, I think, and I remember all the details, but prior to the bomb that we dropped in Iran on their nuclear facilities, I forget, we were moving ships on the entire opposite section of the country to sort of divert the attention in that area. So again, Trump is not someone I think who's going to shy away from the situation. And to one of your points, those who look at Latin America can understand that probably in the last, I would say, 30 years, la mano fuerte de Estados Unidos, and I think there's a whole debate on what's good and bad on what they've done when it comes to taking down regimes, or how they've done it, or who they've empowered. That's a whole nother conversation. But the reality is that esa mano fuerte, that strong hand from the United States, and that presence that the United States used to have in Latin America is not the same. That has allowed China and Russia to play the roles that they have. We're also in a fascinating time, I think, in Latin America, where you do have governments, por ejemplo, in Honduras, with Xiomara, who's really one of the first socialist presidents of Honduras, coming into power. But then you have individuals like Javier Milei, president in Argentina. So there is, I think, this battle of the future of Latin America in this way. Daniel, going to you, what are your thoughts on what would happen if, hypothetically, the United States were to play a role in taking down the Maduro regime? I'm curious on what do you think, how the country would respond? Obviously, there's a lot of people who have protested, but I'm under the impression that there are those individuals that are supportive of the regime. I can't tell you the percentage. I think some of them might be because they were just born into it and this is what they know. They've sort of been indoctrinated in this space. There's nothing else that they've seen. And then there are some who are just participating in a lot of the robbery and in the corruption of the government. So the two-part question to you is, what do you think would happen internally in Venezuela? Would there be a big enough movement in support of that regime coming down? And second, what do you believe would happen to the region? Would other either dictatorships or would other countries sort of have that respect that they used to have to the United States?
Well, first, I just want to say that you're right that there's a battle in Latin America of ideas, but it's also a battle of influence. And it's not about really just China and Russia. It is the Cubans that have been actually interfering in all these elections around Latin America since they came into power in 1959. I mean, how do you think Chavez came into power? How do you think in Argentina the Kirchners came into power? How do you think Lula came into power in Brazil? They're all part of the Forum of Sao Paulo, which is this a criminal narco-trafficking organization whose goal is to conquer all of Latin America with socialist governments. Daniel Ortega of Nicaragua is there, Xiomara Castro of Honduras is there, Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico is there. Almost all of Latin America is controlled by these people. Colombia under Petro. We have very few governments that are not in their pocket, including, of course, Argentina and El Salvador. But they are some of the few, and they're not the largest countries either. So I think that it's time for the U.S. to understand that we are fighting evil forces that are trying to then overthrow America's freedom. And the only way to take them is to attack, not to just be constantly in the defense. I mean, none of this would have happened if we had actually stopped Castro from the beginning. So now it's time to fix that original error. And in Venezuela, if the regime were to fall, it would be a great day. And I'm telling you, the celebrations would be amazing. The vast majority of the population would celebrate it. And of course, all of the diaspora. You have to remember, Venezuela right now is the largest refugee crisis in the world. There are 9 million Venezuelans outside of our country, out of a population that used to be 30 million. All of those Venezuelans would celebrate. Among the Venezuelans remaining there, maybe 10 to 20% support the regime. How many of them would actually resist? Probably the truth is the military itself that is paid, but most of them really would be cowards. I don't know if you've seen the video of when there was a drone attack that wasn't successful against Maduro, and it exploded in the air by mistake. It didn't achieve its objective, and it was in the middle of a military parade, and all of the military officers just ran away. They didn't go to defend the president. They ran away like chicken. It was really funny because these people are just there because they're paid to be there. They're not there because they have a commitment to the regime. And so, you know, I think it would be great for the United States because an underappreciated aspect of other countries being free is that the fact that Venezuela today is such a poor country ruled under socialism has meant much higher gas prices for Americans, for example. Venezuela used to produce over 3 million barrels of oil per day. Right now, it produces less than 500,000. Imagine if we suddenly had millions more barrels per day produced worldwide. Gas prices would be lower, your cost of living would be lower. Imagine all the trade we could do with Venezuela, not just in the energy sector, but with tourism, other investments. Venezuela used to be a hub for advertisement and other sectors. So that's the kind of thing that I think we need to take advantage of and understand that it would be very beneficial. Venezuela would be a new economic miracle, like all the socialist countries that have left socialism in Eastern Europe, like what we see in Argentina now under Milei. The question really is whether that's what the Trump administration wants to do. I think there are different factions. There's people who want to do different things. There's people who are only interested in the drug part. There's people who I believe have positioned those military assets in the Caribbean to ensure that they have the chance to actually topple the regime if the situation lends itself for them to do it. But nothing is assured. If you ask me what chances are that the regime is going to be overthrown, I still think they're very small.
I agree with that. I don't think that this is going to be just an overthrow and then the US is going to come over and take control of the country and take over the oil reserves. And it's going to be something where it's just plundering the natural resources to use for itself. I don't think that's going to be the case at all. I think we should mention that, yes, Venezuela prior to Chavez and prior to Maduro was a country so rich in natural resources, and it just shows, like, once you have all of these resources, but you add a little drop of socialism and communism to it, it all goes to shit.
Yeah.
No,
And so
absolutely.
that can happen absolutely anywhere. I think that this is a national security issue, and I think since he mentioned migration and the fact that there's so many Venezuelans that are refugees in all parts of the world, 9 million, we have a lot of those here in this country. We have close to 1,607,000, which is what was last recorded on TPS status, temporary protection status, meaning these are people that were told they can come here because of the situation in the country, but need to go back. The idea was not to legally migrate all of these people here to the US. So I think that the reason this is also happening is because we want to make it okay for them to go back to their country. And a regime change and taking out Maduro and having it being replaced by a legitimate government is one way to do that, and to show, hey, yeah, we gave you temporary status. Now things are all right back home. So now you could go.
Yeah.
So I think that's another important aspect of all this.
Yeah, there's Venezuela is one of those stories where I think, man, there's a I feel bad using the word fascinating aspect of it, but it's a real life story of what an amazing country with incredible resources, un gran pueblo, can look like if you go back 50 years, you go back 40 years. And then a real life experiment of what socialism does to a country. And I want to believe that in the near future, for sure in our lifetime, that we will see that story go back. What does it look like that we can look at 40 years ago, and what it looked like in the time of Chavez and Maduro, and then what it looks like when you took socialism out of the equation? Because I've heard so many stories. My el esposo, the husband of my cousin, his family is from Ecuador, but they immigrated into Venezuela because Venezuela, this is back again like 45 years ago, was the country in Latin America that people would immigrate to work. People were not looking at the United States. People around Ecuador, Chile, Peru, they were looking at Venezuela as the place that had a similar language.
My own grandparents immigrated to Venezuela in the 1950s. Venezuela welcomed millions of people because nobody from Venezuela thought of leaving Venezuela. I wouldn't have left if the socialist regime hadn't been in power. Why would I have left? I had a great life, a great family. I would have gone to college near my home. I would have worked there. I would have absolutely traveled here as a tourist to spend my money, but not to live here. The weather's much better down there. You know, her family and friends are there. Most people don't want to leave their countries.
Yeah, and I think, just because you reminded me of something that's really important, and you just mentioned, yes, a lot of people migrated to Venezuela, including a lot of Cubans, right?
Yes.
What happens when you let the borders a little too open, right? Unfortunately, your country can be open to the influence of foreign
I would
nationals and of foreign
disagree. I would
interests.
disagree that what happened to Venezuela had anything to do with migration. The Cubans that went to Venezuela were fleeing the Castro regime, including my math teacher, by the way, who now had to leave to Spain. What happened to Venezuela was actually the influence of a foreign government, Cuba that trained Maduro, but it wasn't Cuban migrants who were voting for Chavez. If anything, they warned Venezuelans against them.
No, that is true. That is completely true. What I'm saying is when you allow large amounts of migration, unfortunately, there are some people that get infiltrated through it that aren't those good actors. And so obviously the Cuban regime couldn't have access to Venezuela. The Cuban government couldn't have access to Venezuela without having anybody on the ground. And I think that among those refugees from Cuba, there might have been actors that Cuba sent themselves.
Potentially,
go
but
into strategic
what they
places
did
and
was
do
that
that.
they trained Venezuelans in Cuba, and they trained people from other countries in Cuba. But I haven't heard of a single case of a Cuban person that came before Chavez who like elected him or whatever. Like I don't think it would be fair to say that it had anything to do with migration. I think it is.
Migration does come. That's where we differ. You know, I do believe that migration comes with migration of ideas, and some people.
But what I'm
do
saying is that the
integrate
ideas that
it.
migrated
It's a
from
mix.
Cuba to Venezuela were actually against socialism. There's no
Yeah,
evidence that
I agree. The
helped
majority
Chavez.
of them were 1,000%. The majority of them were.
No, so I hear you guys on the different points. What I am curious, I do want to ask Jana before moving on to the next topic, because at Turning Point USA, you guys, I think one of the things you guys are famous for is bringing up the topic of socialism into universities. I forget the slogan. I think "Government sucks" is one of the slogans you guys have. There's another one
Big
about
government.
socialism.
Socialism
Yeah,
sucks. I think
socialism
it is.
sucks.
Socialism sucks. Okay.
Yeah, so I was with Turning Point USA, or 501c3 organization or nonprofit, up until 2022, and that is what they do. They go into these college campuses, universities, high schools, and they promote the values of conservatism, and they explain how socialism works, or rather how it doesn't work when applied to reality. And so it's a space on campuses for students to probably hear for the first time ever ideas that aren't exactly left wing. And that's why it's been so successful. And I think and what they do is so necessary, because unfortunately, we know, statistically speaking, the majority of people that teach in universities and colleges and high schools, everything, lean more left wing. And so there needs to be a conservative presence there so that everybody isn't as brainwashed. There needs to be an outlet. Right now, I work for Turning Point Action. I'm a media spokesperson for them. And so that's the C4, where the political, oh, it says it in the name, or the
Yeah.
action branch. And so what we do is more in the community. It's open to everybody, no matter the age range. And the idea is to get everybody involved at whatever capacity that they can, right? Some people can't knock doors because they physically can't, or they don't have the time, or they can't make 500 phone calls, send 500 texts. The idea is to create community within the conservative, right-wing Republican population, so that we remind each other to go vote during
Yeah,
election.
and I
So
bring it
that's
up
what
because
we got.
I think on the conversation of Venezuela, it's important
Yeah.
because we have seen that wave of acceptance among sort of college students, younger folks. I mean, we're even seeing folks like Mondami, who is now the leader within the Democrat. He's the leader as a candidate for possibly being the new mayor of New York. There's also the candidate in Minneapolis, Minnesota, who's also a part of the Democratic Socialists. So I think we have to have these conversations. But I do want to turn over now to the conversation around the U.S. government taking 10% ownership in Intel. Something that I was talking with our guest prior to this recording is that I do think this is a multi-layered conversation. There are a lot of components and there are a lot of different perspectives. I would say perspectives within conservatives. There are conservatives who stand strong with Donald Trump on this move, and they praise what he's done. And then there are other conservatives within the Republican Party who are saying this is a step too far for what the role of government is. Before going into the questions, I think it's fascinating to kind of study Donald Trump and how he comes about some of these strategies. And from a lot of the reporting that I've seen is that Donald Trump he was in the morning, he was watching Fox Business. He was watching the Maria Bartiromo show, where he saw Maria Bartiromo talk about a letter from Senator Tom Cotton to Intel expressing his concerns that Intel was becoming too friendly with China. This reporter from the Wall Street Journal goes back, looks at the Fox Business, looks at the timing of that segment, and then looks at the timing when the president tweeted, well, not tweeted, but sent out a truth on Truth Social, where he calls for the CEO of Intel to resign. I just think it's fascinating. Donald Trump has been a president who many times is watching Fox and Friends, Fox Business, and is looking at the news and is quickly reacting on Twitter. What happens is the Intel CEO comes to Washington, begins to talk with President Donald Trump, and at the end they come to an agreement where he doesn't resign, where he continues being part of the company, where they're going to increase the amount of manufacturing they're going to do in the United States, and where 10% of Intel becomes part of the U.S. ownership. Now, Daniel, you're on one side here on the conservative spectrum when it comes to this topic. Driena, you're on the other. Driena, I want to start with you. Look, like I mentioned, there's multiple layers to this. I'm going to focus specifically just on where we're at. And it's the fact that the U.S. Is taking ownership of a company. For many, we just talked about Venezuela. We just talked about the fact that in Venezuela, they took ownership of the oil reserves. They took ownership of the airplanes. Now, this is very different in the sense that the U.S. isn't taking full ownership. They're not taking it completely away from the private sector, but it's 10%. Give us your opinion on this.
Yeah.
And also, what do you say to the critics that say, hey, it's 10% now, it's 50% in the future, it's 100% 20 years from now?
So to start with, I definitely wouldn't agree with any government nationalizing, right, a private company. That's what they did in Venezuela. And they did it by force, right? They just took over these oil companies, these businesses. That's what they do in socialism and communism and dictatorships. There is no choice. There is none of that, right?
Just to push back a little bit, and I'm going to push back on Daniel as well. The order of the events are interesting. That Trump, some people are saying the criticism here is he called for the CEO to resign.
Yeah.
And we know the president, I mean, this is a private company, but the president has that kind of power. Trump is like the kind of guy that through truth, he can move things. And so he kind of forced his hand a little bit. Again, some of the reports say that we don't know that for a fact, but just the circumstances do seem like there was a little bit of power moves here. So, I mean, I'm going to let you get your point out, but I do think there was a little bit of a power move here from the president to get that 10%.
Well, the president has free speech, just like all of us do. So he's obviously going to give his opinion on every subject that comes to mind and promptly tweet about it or post about it. That's nothing new. Like I was saying, the difference between this grab of this 10% of this company is that it is in return for something, right? I obviously am not in support of two things separately. I'm not in support of the government giving any kind of aid to private companies. There shouldn't be bailouts. There shouldn't be any kind of grants. There shouldn't be any of that to begin with. But it exists. And it's been going on for many, many years, right? And two, I also don't believe in the government taking ownership or any percentage of ownership of any private company on its own. But here's where my opinion has to naturally change. If these companies, and Intel has definitely already for many years, even prior to Trump being in office, had aid and from the government,
multi-million, hundreds of millions, I think up to the billions.
Taxpayer dollars. They've gotten free taxpayer dollars with nothing in return. Basically. This is Trump's way of being a businessman and saying, hey, the American taxpayer bailed you guys out, or the American taxpayer helped invest in your company, and maybe it wouldn't have been as successful as it is now without it. We need something back in return. So absolutely, I am in favor of getting something in return for money that was granted to this company. If that weren't the case, then absolutely I'd be against it. So it's completely different, and it's irrelevant to, and there's no comparison to this happening in a country like Venezuela, where the government comes in and just takes what it wants.
Yeah, I want to jump in here because that's one of the key points. From what I'm hearing from you, you're looking at just the reality of the circumstances.
Yeah, and the one last thing I wanted to say is I hope that this is the case going forward for every company if they want to get a single cent of taxpayer-funded money and grants. If you want a bailout from the company, if you want a grant, if you want a bailout from the government, if you want a grant from the government paid for by U.S. tax dollars, then absolutely the government, i.e. we, should have a percentage, a stake within that company. We should get some kind of investment in it, and it should go back to us, the U.S. citizens. So maybe this will dissuade in the future more companies from getting bailouts and more companies from getting grants, because they know it's not just going to be free money. They have to give something back in return.
Yeah, and Daniel, going to you, that is one of the main points I've heard in this conversation, that the U.S. for decades has bailed out companies. I think in our lifetime, one of the most historic one was in 2008, where we bailed out dozens of financial institutions. There's the example where even Warren Buffett came in and took a stake. I'm forgetting in which institution, but he took a stake. He put, I think, almost the same amount that the U.S. government did. His investment went over more than 100x of what he put in. The U.S., I believe, in some of these circumstances, didn't even get the payment back. It was really just a like a grant of money that
It was a loan. It was the TARP program. Everybody repaid the loan. Yeah, yeah.
So some of them on loans, but then you have also the under the Obama administration, many of the climate change companies, solar companies, green energy companies that received a lot of funding. So in the United States, if we try to take the point of Driena here, realistically, the U.S. does engage in corporate welfare, which I think that's its own conversation. Should the U.S. be engaging in corporate welfare? But specifically to this point, since the U.S. does do this, and the CHIPS Act, which was passed under the Biden administration, supported by many Republicans, which is meant to encourage companies to build, to manufacture here in the United States, specifically chips, semiconductors, technology-focused items that are mainly done in Taiwan and China. What do we get in return? What's your opinion here? And what's your argument to the critics that say this is just the U.S. getting a piece of the pie when we're already putting money into these companies?
Number one, on the Intel specific takeover, the U.S. had already made these grants, which were authorized by Congress. I disagree with the grants. I don't think the CHIPS Act should have passed, but it did. Congress did not authorize the president to take over 10% of the company in return. So this is illegal on its own right, but Intel voluntarily agreed because they were pressured. My concern is not even just about Intel, because Intel is too small to matter for the U.S. My concern is that the Secretary of Commerce, Lutnick, already said that they're going to take over more companies. And what is the definition of socialism? Government ownership or control over the means of production. This is literally a socialist move. And yes, it started with 10%. They already announced they're going to take over more companies. They're saying that they're not going to control the operation of the company. Then why do you take over 10% of the shares? People say, well, this is just to get paid back. Then sell the shares. You can sell the shares right now in the market and get paid back. But they don't want to sell them. So they obviously do want control, which is control under Trump for the next 3 years, but it might be control under AOC as president for the following 4 years. And if you think corporations are woke now, get ready for woke corporations when President AOC owns 40% of the shares of a major U.S. company. Get ready for the union mandates, for the diversity mandates. And these companies are going to underperform. We already have plenty of studies that show, not just from third world countries, but in Europe, that this is a very common kind of practice of giving money to companies in exchange for shares, that those corporations then compete for government dollars rather than for the private market. So they underperform because they're appealing with lobbyists to politicians rather than to what's most efficient, cutting costs, increasing revenue. So this is a terrible move. I understand the impulse of the administration because for them, this is like a business. But the reality is that the government is not a business. The government is not your friend. And President Trump and Secretary Lutnick do not own the U.S. government. They only have temporary custody for 4 years. If they did own it, it would be a different matter, right? If it was the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where the king owns the oil company, it's essentially a private company because the king is absolute emperor. But that's not what we have here. This is, overstepping the legal authority. This is overstepping the role of government. And this is going to lead to a lot of unintended negative consequences.
Yeah, what are the guardrails there, right? So to his point, because part of the deal is that if Intel does go below 51% of production of some of their chips and semiconductors, the United States automatically, I forget if they automatically get 5% more or they're able to purchase 5% more. So there is already just sort of these mechanisms where they can take more ownership.
The U.S. government shouldn't be telling companies where they make things or what they produce. That's what we already have the tax system for. We have a 21% corporate tax rate.
It shouldn't, and I agree. The corporate tax rate should be much, much lower or non-existent. Taxation is theft. But since we have it, I'll always advocate for it being as low as possible, both for the individual and for corporations. But since, unfortunately, this comes back to reality. Obviously, I'm against any kind of government handout to private corporations. Obviously, I'm against the government having ownership of companies. But unfortunately, the reality is that these companies have already gotten millions and millions and millions in taxpayer subsidies. And we need something back. It's the same.
Why don't
exact
they
thing
sell
that
the
Trump-
shares?
Let me just finish real quick. And it's the same thing with Trump and the tariffs. For so many years, there's so many countries that have been imposing unjust tariffs on the US. And so Trump is now amping up the tariffs on them to try to recuperate some of that for our benefit, for the American public's benefit.
Well,
That
that's
weren't
also
the
not
case,
true.
it wouldn't-
Israel and
that weren't the
Singapore
case.
have no
And
tariffs on the
the
US.
last time I did this, I didn't interrupt you. So let me just finish my point. So I think that this move is going to do the opposite of what you're mentioning, which is it's going to discourage more companies to look for and ask for government aid because paid for taxpayer dollars, again, because they're going to know that we're going to want something in return for it. And it's something that's going to benefit us. So I think the long-term look of this is that we are going to discourage cronyism and corporatism. Just because this happened doesn't mean that the government is going to voluntarily take over a private company or a percentage of any kind of corporation. That is illegal. That is socialism. That is communism. They have to willingly, obviously, provide that percentage that is being asked for, and they're not going to offer it for free, right? The only reason they would offer it is if they think it is beneficial for them to take the government subsidy that the government offers and then give that in return. So we're not talking about anything being done via coercion.
But what do you mean? The government already announced they're going to take over more companies, and it is absolutely a coercion because the government can sanction them.
The government can't do that. The government cannot announce that it is going to take over companies, okay? What it says
The government
is
can
that
sanction them in exchange.
can sanction them, can
Yes, it can take all their government
is
contracts
not-
away.
the government is not saying that we are going to start taking 10% of random companies.
Secretary Lutnick said they're going to take over more companies.
Period.
So I agree to kind of put
Where
some of
you-
these
you
things
have to
here.
pull that up. You have to pull that up. Who said it?
Secretary Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce, said
What
that
were the
Intel
exact
is just
words
the
used?
first of many companies that are going to come.
Yes, first of many companies to come that have received government subsidies, millions, and that are going to have to pay.
So we're now going to retroactively see how much money people got, and then we're going to take over parts of their companies arbitrarily.
That would absolutely, again, this is not this labor secretary announcing that we're going to randomly start looking at companies and taking over 10%. That is false. That is fake news.
No, but wait. Imagine I went around every American who receives tax credits and say, now, if you've been receiving tax credits that Congress authorized by law for 10 years, you have to pay me back now.
Well, this was something that this corporation, Intel, did this voluntarily, right?
Well, because they know the consequences if they didn't agree
What
to
would be
it.
the consequences? Fair laws?
They lose all their government contracts. They can't enter government buildings like what Trump already did to all the law firms.
Great. So these were privileges, not rights, that they had before. So
But you understand these are sanctions. This is coercion.
if the sanctions are being treated like every other company and having privileges taken away from them and having government,
I think this
I'm
is
gonna jump in here real quick.
justifying, yeah.
then that is absolutely pressure.
Okay, and
but
by the
that's
way,
not
if
a
what we
punishment.
want is to get paid back, then why doesn't the government sell the shares and get the money? Why do they want to keep the
Because
shares?
if you invest, you have to wait for shares to grow, right? That's the whole
So
point
the
of
government is
buying
not
them,
going to.
holding on to your shares, waiting for that to grow to get some kind of money.
Or the company can go broke, right? Intel may go broke and they
Can,
lose all
but
the
I
money.
strongly doubt Intel is going to go broke anytime soon.
I'm gonna jump in here real quick because this is the conversation. I think kind of how I phrased it. Where conservatives, I think, within the movement or within the party are having these discussions, and there's a lot of nuances to this. This is a topic that I would encourage our audience to look into because there are a lot of slippery slopes in my opinion here. Danny, I do think you're making a lot of good points when it comes to what's next. What happens? Lutnick did talk about bringing other people to the table. For some, they'll view that as coercion. For some, they'll view that as negotiations. For some, they'll say, well, what happens, like Daniel said, when it's a AOC? Other people will say, well, when these companies are already getting funding from us, what are we getting in return? What I do want to, before going on to the next topic, Daniel, I know that you, there are areas where you are critical of the administration. So I want to ask you kind of like a broader question within this topic, but also outside of it. Do you hold any concerns that Donald Trump, I think it's fascinating, he's brought in a lot of new people into the Republican Party. There are more voters who have voted for a Republican president than in several other elections. He won the popular vote. But he's also not your traditional Republican when it comes to sort of this free market, free enterprise, capitalist approach. There are areas where he blurs the line. Our next topic is going to be on the courts and where some of those blurred lines are within the executive orders. My question to you is, do you hold any concern or do you have any una crítica of the approach that the president does in certain areas? Do you think this will evolve the Republican Party in some of its areas? Do you think, for example, Marco Rubio, a J.D. Vance in the future will hold some of these perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, my main concern is a lot of people just defend this because Trump did it. The reality is that if Biden had done this, everybody would be calling this socialism. It's really simple. Just like they did when Obama took over and nationalized the auto companies in exchange for subsidies. And nobody said that this was the U.S. government getting paid back. They said that it was a bailout and that it was socialism and that it was bad because it was bad and because it was socialism. The difference is that Trump is the one doing it now, and it's framed as America first. Same as the issue with trade. We're now paying much more for imported goods that are used to make things in America. People are talking about national security as if our steel was imported from China, when American steel never came from China. It came from Canada, the EU, South Korea. And now it's much harder to create factories in America that need steel, to make cars in America that need steel and aluminum because of these tariffs. And they say it's all about reciprocity. These countries are tariffing us. The reality is that now we have a 10% tariff on Israel, on Singapore, on many other countries that have no tariffs on the United States. They have zero tariffs on the United States. So I think this is just old school protectionism. I fear that voters will come to believe it because the leader that they like for other reasons, which is Trump, is the one advocating for it. People didn't vote for Trump because of this. People voted for Trump because they like him, because he's a good speaker, he's charismatic, he has good instincts. But, these are ideas that have failed for centuries. These arguments are nothing new. And I am all for fighting against China. China is a separate issue. They are the enemy of the United States. It's worth America becoming poorer to make China poorer, but it's not worth America becoming poorer to make Israel, to make Canada, to make the EU poorer.
Daniel, so I jump in here. Driena, I'm going to let you get into the topic as well, but I want to do it under the context of our last segment, the legal roadblocks, Trump and the courts. So in some of these areas, tariffs and immigration, Trump has seen a battle when it comes to courts. Many of these lower courts, to be specific, district courts, this is not necessarily the Supreme Court on many of these topics, has put a block on some of these areas. When it comes to tariffs, Driena, do you think, so it's a kind of a two-part question. I'll let you sort of, if you want to respond to some of the stuff that Daniel has said, but also, is the president, the way he's going about it, the correct way? What I mean by that is some of these courts have said that some of these sort of policies should be coming out of Congress. Do you think the president is within sort of his, what do they see, his right, his jurisdiction in this space?
I think that there's a lot of lower courts in this country making policy from the bench. And the problem is that there's so many that are doing this, and there isn't enough time to get through all of these cases and get it to the Supreme Court to then strike it down, which almost every single one of these lower court decisions by left-wing judges have been shut down and have been overturned. And I think that the one with tariffs is definitely, something that's going to be overturned, even though right now we still are implying those tariffs. And the one that has to do with migration is also going to be overturned as well. It's just a matter of time. People voted for President Trump not because he's popular too, which he is, but because he's a businessman. Okay, that's what he's been for all of time. That's what we know him
That's
from
what he's known
before
for.
he got into politics. Absolutely. And nobody's more of a capitalist than me. I don't think anybody is more of a capitalist also than President Trump, but we cannot live in a free capitalist country. We cannot have capitalism, true free market capitalism within the US, but then have other countries that don't abide by the same rules, that don't apply these free market rules to us. We can't have, no tariffs whatsoever amongst ourselves, no taxes, but then another country imposes a different playing system, because then it's not fair. So this is just the reality that exists. We're dealing with reality here, not theory. I understand that. As somebody that would want zero taxes and zero tariffs within ourselves, like within the country, and back and forth with other countries, because that's what would be fair, fantastic, but that is not the case. That is not what we're dealing with. So we have to make sure that the American citizen isn't the one getting screwed over. And that is what President Trump is doing. And so yeah, I think that these lower courts are engaging in lawfare to subvert not just the president's will, right, but the will of the people, because we overwhelmingly voted for his policies. He won the popular vote, he won the electoral vote, and these lower courts are subverting the will of the people. And nothing that the president has done so far, including all of these things that lower left-wing courts have struck down, and then, a higher court or the Supreme Court has applied. I mean, none of these things have been unconstitutional, and none of these things that Trump has done has been outside of the realm of power that he has as president.
Yeah, to the Supreme Court. Many of these are going to go to the Supreme Court. They're not going to stay where they are now. Dan, I do want to get you to take a little bit on. I mentioned there's two in the news. There's two things that have been highlighted. Is the one on the tariffs, but then the one on immigration, where the court has said that the president is not allowed to roll back the asylum access at the southern border, that they must continue to allow it. They're saying it's outside of the law for him to do these suspensions. I want to get your take in general when it comes to sort of Trump's battle with the courts, but also if you have an opinion specifically on these asylum cases that have been taken away.
Well, I hope the Trump administration is successful on the asylum fight in the court. I do think, however, that not on the merits of what policy I think should be. The Immigration and Nationality Act is very clear that everybody who is in U.S. soil does have the right to claim asylum. And I think the Trump administration is going to solve that very easily, because they're just detaining everybody until their court date. And they just brought on 600 additional immigration judges through the military that Pete Hex had authorized yesterday. That's fantastic. Everybody's going to get a hearing. Everybody's going to get due process. And then 90% of them are going to get denied and are going to be deported immediately. So now with all the funding from Congress, this is going to get sorted out regardless of what courts rule. On the tariff side, that it was the DC Federal Circuit that ruled by a large majority that these are unconstitutional, because the Constitution clearly states that it is Congress that has the power to lay tariffs, except for emergencies that Congress laid out in a law, and that this does not count for. And I think Driena talked about fairness and other countries imposing tariffs on us. I totally agree with reciprocity. These tariffs are not reciprocal, they're much higher, and there are many countries that have no tariffs on U.S. goods, including Singapore, including Israel, including Australia, that are now we're imposing over 10% tariff rates on goods from those countries. Even the treaty that Trump himself wrote, the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, he broke it with these tariffs by imposing additional tariffs on them. Mexico and Canada were not breaking the treaty. They were following the treaty that Trump himself drafted and ratified. So that is my concern with what the administration is doing legally.
We are at time, but this is not the last time that this topic will come up. Tariffs, immigration, sort of the battle between Trump and the courts will continue to be front and center on various topics. So make sure to stay connected here on The Game to see how this conversation develops. I want to thank Driena for being here in studio with us. Daniel, thank you for joining us as well. I appreciate I would say the strong analysis and also the strong point of views that you guys brought in. It's been a fascinating show and a fascinating discussion. And to our audience who tune in, thank you for being here on The Game, where we go play by play, breaking down the game of politics.